you, and welcome to the Deloitte Health Connect webcast. My name is Lavashni Reddy, and I'm a director in our life sciences and consulting practice in Switzerland. Thank you very much for joining us for the second part of our discussion about patient equality. This is a series of webinars on patient equality, and I'm very excited to get together today with our thought leaders and experts from the industry. We are co-hosting the session with our Healthcare and Businesswomen Association, as well as the Singularity University. I think you all agree with me. For years, we've been talking about patient centricity, but the patient is really genuinely at the center. So what if we talked about, instead of making patients equal partners, from research and development into the healthcare? How would that change the industry? Last week, we discussed what it meant to treat patients as equal partners in the delivery of healthcare. We talked about the shift in the patient as a consumer, and we also explored how it would be to empower patients by giving them control over their data. This evening, we will begin part 2 of our discussion around focusing on what it would mean to bring the patient into the research and development space, getting their voice in the process from the beginning, and the importance of patient engagement in clinical development and the insights that can be gathered to improve clinical research. We all know patients are critical for a clinical trial. However, their voice and those that care for them are far too often not included in the study design protocols, and therefore a critical piece of insight into whether the drug is actually being developed for the right reasons and will actually be beneficial and improve the quality of life for the patient is often not heard. But how long can pharma and biotech actually continue? We all know that the ROI continues to decrease and the cost per patient continues to increase. So actually incorporating the patient voice into clinical trial design can help improve not only patient retention, but also compliance, whilst also improving efficiency, impact, cost, and the time of completion to trials, thereby improving the ROI. So what if patient-centered moves to becoming more mainstream and legislated? Should it actually be part of the protocol? Should it be mandated by the regulatory bodies? How can crowdsourcing also be used to harness the patient voice? And what impact can technology have on patient centricity? So today we will look to address these questions and much more as the role of the patient in clinical trials continues to evolve. We want to ensure this is a dialogue and you are part of this conversation. So please feel free to be part of the conversation by using the chat box at any time during the webinar to ask your questions. Firstly, I'd like to introduce our panel, and I'd like to start off by introducing Dana Lewis, who is the founder of Open Apps and the advocate of patient-driven research and innovation. So Dana, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. As she mentioned, I'm the founder of Open APS. I'm a patient living with type 1 diabetes for almost 18 years now. So I have well over a decade, almost 2 decades experience of being an advocate for patients, being involved in clinical trial research at a number of stages, but most recently, because of my work with Open APS in the last couple of years, I've actually played the role of a researcher as well as a patient advocate working in this space. So it's been kind of interesting to see the evolution of, having patients be an add-on at the end of the research process and giving feedback kind of at the too late stage, which we'll talk about today, to being able to be there at the beginning when studies are being designed. So I'm excited to share that experience.
Doing that since 2003.
Thanks, Sam. Then I would like to move on to Jane Shaw. Jane, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Jane Shaw. I'm a relative newbie to the world of patient advocacy, not like Dana. So I was diagnosed 2 years ago with type 2 breast cancer. As you might gather from my accent, I'm British, but living in Basel in Switzerland. And through my treatment at the Basel University Hospital, I'm working with Professor Walter Weber. I've been appointed as the global patient advocate for a breast surgery consortium called the Oncoplastic Breast Consortium. And we look as a non-profit organization to actually promote standards and knowledge and choices for women to ensure they get much better outcomes around their breast cancer choices. So not exactly clinical research, but I do actually also in my day job, I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry. So it's been very interesting coming as a relatively, as I say, newbie to the patient advocacy world to now see things from a patient side. And really, I think this whole dialogue around patients is critically important.
Okay. And another familiar face together with Dana's, if you attended our webcast last week, Lucien Engel.
Hi there, Lucien Engel indeed. This is my 12th call, so the battery power ran out of my earbud, so that's why I got the big ears right now. I'm one of the Edge Fellows for the Center for the Edge at Deloitte. We're basically advisories to Deloitte in a non-commercial role. Spent the last 12 years at Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, where I set stage for an innovation center on the intersection of technology and patient empowerment at the other one, to really try to get the voices of everyone heard in innovation in the broader sense of the word. Also faculty at Singularity University, exponential medicine into it, and I'm blogging on LinkedIn for the Washington Post and on my own website. Back to you, Linda.
Great, thanks, Lucia. And lastly, we have my colleague who will also co-host with me today, Matthew Clement.
Hi there, I'm Matthew Clement. I'm a director in the life sciences practice of our Basel office. And I've been involved in a number of these panel discussions. So really pleased to be here with everyone this evening, and glad that so many of you could join us when you've probably got one eye on the election. So we've promised to announce any news if we have it. Before we dive too far in, we'd love to get some feedback from the participants on this call using a Mentee survey. So we're going to put the link up on the screen, and you can use your phone to click on it, or you can click on the link that is in the chat panel on the side. And we'd love to ask the question of what benefits could come from including patients as equals in clinical development. So if you go to the link and maybe put one or two words in, so you'll get an app that looks like that. And that will then show up on the screen.
So that's great. Thank you very much for filling it in. I mean, we can see some of the trust is some of the key words coming out. Higher relevance, effectiveness.
Dana, maybe some reflections for you as a patient, whether these resonate.
Yeah, these definitely resonate. I think trust is obviously a super big one. Trust all the way through the process, but I'm also struck by there's a couple of different phrases, but the word better is used for so many things: better patient engagement, better endpoints, better everything basically. So I'm glad to hear that the audience shares this perspective, because I think that's really important. But I also think faster is something that I see that's super relevant. Of the more we do together, better, faster, that's better for everybody.
Great. And Sam, maybe a perspective from the other side of the table.
Yeah, thank you. Clinicians, we certainly preach, and I believe we really do feel that we're patient-centric, but we're trained to be from the other side of the table, right? So we're focused on the outcomes, the adherence. And so that's what strikes me, is that in engaging people as equals, we actually achieve what we want as clinicians, as people that are driving the care and the research side. So it benefits everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks for that. Naveshni, can I hand back over to you and maybe get the discussion started?
Maybe I could intervene for a bit. So in the word cloud, could you put up the word cloud for a second again? I think, Sarah. What I like not to say most, but what I like very much is that it states more disease knowledge. We think we have all the knowledge at hand already, but that's typically from a research and from a medical perspective. And like we always like to say, the patients know best. I think patients are experts in having their disease, and bringing that knowledge in early on also I think is a very important topic, and we might touch on that during our discussion, but I like it very much that it was stated over here as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lucian. I mean, certainly, yes, we will touch on some of this during our conversation, and it is, thank you very much also to the attendees for completing this. It gives us a good understanding on, how you also see patient equality and what benefits it can derive. So let me just if we get started with some of the questions that we have for our conversation this afternoon. Certainly we know that pharma and biotech companies are continuously trying to adopt and implement more effective or innovative ways to accelerate drug launches. The market is becoming extremely competitive. And as I said earlier, ROI continues to be an issue. The cost of assets also continues to rise. So one way pharma and biotech companies, and this is something that has been happening over the last few years, it's been talking more around patient equality. But what actually does patient equality mean? So I'd like to open up to our panel and to Sam and to Dana by asking you and to Jane, by asking you, how would you define the term patient equality in clinical development? And what do you think it means also to the patient when they hear that pharma is talking about patient equality?
Shall I take that one? So, I mean, I think for me, actually, I think in 2020 particularly, it's very interesting. The word equality is obviously one that we've debated from parliaments to bars across the world. And, bars might seem a strange place to start, but actually, I think patient equality is no different from any other quality or indeed inequality topic that we talk about. And I think I'm right in saying that for most patients, we've all probably encountered unconscious bias in our interactions with clinicians, with scientists, and indeed with the pharma industry. I've actually had direct conversations with basic research scientists who voiced to me, knowing I'm a patient, their huge fear and skepticism of actually working directly with patients. Because I think, for a scientist, they're looking at a patient as a human being with a cellular and a molecular dysfunction, from whom, they'd really like the tissue samples, that would be great. But they're trying to reduce complexity to understand a system. And then enters, into this conversation, a patient. And a patient obviously is an empowered patient that has a complex mix of intellect, experience, and probably the most scary for those scientists is emotion. And I think that strikes terror into the hearts of many scientists. And I think for us to really get patient equality, we need to break down that fear in the same way as we would with any inequality. We need to encourage and help the clinical department, the clinical development community to educate themselves. And we need to challenge their own beliefs and their stereotypes of, the emotional patient begging for a life-saving cure to much more of an informed and articulate agency and voice to really drive the research agenda. So for me, that equality is something that I think we need to really work with the agencies of science and pharma to break down those barriers.
And I think one of the challenges when we talk about equality, we talk about adding patients into processes that are designed for the people working in healthcare, is the power dynamics in healthcare are off by default. I think Sam used the analogy of talking about being across the table, but it sometimes feels like there's a ladder and the patient is at the bottom rung of the ladder and has to work their way up and demonstrate expertise in their disease, in healthcare, in themselves, and really advocate to get up to where you're actually having a seat at the table, because patients don't always have a seat at the table to even enter those conversations. So I think when we talk about equality, we have to think about the power dynamics and barriers that exist in healthcare today and kind of re-envision how do we have that place where we come in together and have the ability for patients to contribute recognizing that there's fears and concerns on all sides. And some patients have been traumatized by past healthcare experiences or traumatized by other systems that led them into healthcare. And I think recognizing that those experiences exist and color the, the emotions and the perspectives of people coming in as patients, I think is part of the conversation we have to get to equality, because it's, I always talk about how clinicians are trained and this is their job, but patients aren't trained and we don't get a choice. You're just, it is your life and you don't have a choice and you just have to be there and you have to deal with it. But I think that's just such an important thing to recognize is like when we talk about the emotions and we talk about everything that Jane just mentioned, there's just a different dynamic and perspective of how we come to that table that needs to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, exactly. I think, certainly from the word cloud, it said that if we listen to the patient, it will drive better outcomes. And certainly one of the things on the word cloud that came out was, as Lucien pointed, was you have an increase in disease knowledge. So Jane, this question is to you. When do you think we should be engaging with patients? So is it enough to engage with patients during pre-trial or when they're recruited? Or when should the dialogue actually start with the patient?
And I think that is a key question as we move through the patient involvement journey. We've been talking about patient involvement now for a while, for years. But actually, I do think our ambition, we need to be bolder, and I think we need to change the paradigm. And actually, I think we should not be asking how do we incorporate patients better or at what stage, but rather how do we enable patients to be in the driving seat of the research agenda. So it doesn't mean involving patients more in the trial design, but even before that, how do we enable patients to shape the research agenda in the first place by defining need states that the industry should be focusing on? And then we can work together on the solve. As I think we've all said, patients understand their disease and the lifestyle needs that go with living with that disease much, much better than the medical professionals. So we have a much more a different lens about what is beneficial to our lives, and therefore what advancements would really, really benefit the patients. We know about how to manage our symptoms in a way that improves our daily quality of life. We all understand that the cost of trials is spiraling forever upwards. But I think, as the word cloud demonstrates, if we can truly embrace and trust, I think that trust word is critical. If we can trust patients as skilled intellectual equals, I think we'd find that our success rate and our return on capital will be much improved.
Yeah.
And I think one place that we need to add patients to is thinking about the grant funding of a lot of our research. Not every grant body has patients involved in the funding decisions, but I think that's an important step. I'll give an example of a grant panel I was on a couple of weeks ago where we were talking about, should you evaluate this biomarker to help determine whether a drug is going to be effective in this patient population? And the clinician perspective was, well, this drug is cheap, it's safe, it's effective, it's easy to prescribe, and just check back in 3 to 6 months and see if it works. And as a patient, I raised my hand and said, look, this drug in particular has very known strong GI side effects that prevent people from even making it to 3 weeks, let alone 3 months, and they don't have any idea of the efficacy. And so suffering for 3 to 6 months and then doing a test to find out if it works or not, like there's got to be another way. And this research is proposing another way. And this is valuable for this drug that would reach a huge population of people. And it's just interesting that another clinician noted, like without the patient being part of that process, that would have never been about the conversation and the feedback to that particular grant, which may, impact whether or not it gets funded. And so that's another kind of important place where we don't always have patients involved, but we need more of that patient voice to be part of the consideration of like, even what trials get funded.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a great point, Dana. It is for the funding, but also, incorporating that patient voice into the whole protocol design, and actually understanding the patient, where they're coming from, not only from a social point of view, but also from a geographic and from a location point of view, and what type of system, care system that they have around them. So to Sam, we're always talking about patients should be having a seat at the table in protocol planning and incorporating this patient voice, so that you have more acceptability of the trial. Can you give your perspective on any successes that maybe you have seen about engaging with the patient during this protocol design?
Yeah, I think the point that Dana mentioned about at the grant funding level, I'm starting to see more of that. There's another grant body called PCORI, or Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute at the US, and it's very patient-centric, and they mandate significant patient input throughout, and that's been good. But honestly, I don't really see the implementation of it into the protocol design from my perspective as much as you would expect. The momentum has sort of plateaued, in other words. I think the effort has definitely been greater upstream when especially at the development level, especially at sort of the advocacy regulatory body level. The FDA in the US has been very embracing of patients being present at hearings and sort of driving the direction of the regulatory bodies. But when it comes to the rubber meeting the road, at the time of the design, and Dana makes a really good point. It's not just about adverse events. Actually, the patient perspective can be as fundamental as the primary outcomes of the study. That the bullseye target middle of what we're trying to accomplish in the study can be very different between the patients and the clinicians / researchers. In my world in lupus, we're trying to address the immune response. We're looking at these markers and sort of physician assessment of inflammatory responses clinically. And we can do a fairly good job with a lot of different modalities in treating that. But the patients oftentimes are left still miserable because there's chronic symptoms. Fatigue, pain, cognitive issues are by far the most prevalent symptoms. Yet, we pat ourselves on the back as researchers and clinicians that this number is getting better. And we tell the patients that their labs are better, but they're no better in terms of their quality of life, which is the most important. And that we need to have that translated into the outcomes that the regulatory bodies will accept. It needs to be put into the protocols, but it's not being done as well as we need.
And I think one missing part of that feedback loop is if it's not put into the trials, just like Sam talked about, then that becomes something that the insurance are just like, well, that doesn't matter, right? Like they're not going to fund this treatment or this device or whatever, because like it doesn't improve clinical outcomes. But if we kind of expand what we talk about with clinical outcomes to include, real life experience, quality of life, then maybe we start to shift the conversation on funding too for devices and treatments that actually do help patients. But a lot of time patients are left, saying, well, this, maybe doesn't improve my clinical outcomes a lot, but it improves all of these other symptoms that allows me to do X and Y and Z. But sometimes insurance won't fund it because, it doesn't work, it doesn't count, it doesn't matter. And so that's like another part of the feedback loop, I think, too, that would have a downstream benefit.
Yeah, and just to the patient outcomes and, what they want to see about it. Jane, I think we spoke about this, but how would you make sure that the patient's insights into their own disease is actually taken on board? If you could have a suggestion on what are some of the fundamental changes you would like to see, what would those be?
Yeah, and then I think, if you think about the research agenda, it does obviously break into the disease pathways, the actual, the new treatments. But I do think it comes down to this symptom management of quality of life. And I think there needs to be some way, whether through, some specifics on the protocols that always have to address that. But I think if you can somehow call out that whole symptom management, quality of life, is something that patient involvement has to be in to get funding, then I think by definition you would start to get that patient voice heard a lot more. Because to me that's the big thing that we can bring to it, is that living with the disease. The work I'm doing with the oncoplastic breast cancer surgery, it's very interesting. We did a Delphi study where we were looking at what the research areas should actually be and how we should prioritize our research areas. And it was a global survey, and the responses of the patients were diametrically opposed in terms of the areas they wanted to research in and what was important, to those of the clinicians who scored very, very lowly on the areas that the patients scored very highly. Because then they were very, very focused in their clinician's field, as opposed to, really what are the things that are important to living with cancer. So I think from that point of view, as I say, if we could make sure that quality of life metrics or measures are always explicitly in protocols, I think that would help.
Yeah, I think you also raised a good point is around this engagement of the patient with the clinical study team, because I think, as we move more forward into having the patient voice included and the patient actually having this dialogue, the clinical team will need to consider more soft skills. So I'd like to just kind of pivot more into, being able to, the communication with the patient to boost this trust, which is again another word that came out quite strongly on our word cloud, and help patients actually feel part of something that is of value, not only for themselves, but also for the community, but also for society as a whole. So Sam, to you, how do you think we can bring about more transparency into the trials and in the process so that patients can feel comfortable in trusting the process and trusting the conversations that they're having with clinical researchers?
Yeah, thanks. There is a lot on an individual level. I read anyway, and I hope this is true, that most patients feel that the trust with their primary provider and the principal investigator of a study is the most important relationship, and having that individual level of trust. But really, sort of on a process level, we need processes by which we can engage the patients or have them feel engaged and understand better the whole process, I think, way before the time of potential recruitment. It took me a while to kind of have this sink in as a clinician, but at the time when people are really sick and potentially need to go into a clinical protocol, it's the most vulnerable time. And to then throw in this whole concept of a trial and all the language around it and all the regulatory aspects of it, I can only imagine, still to this day, but I have empathy for just how complex that construct is for somebody to go through when they are sick. So if we had a better foundation whereby we're educating the general public, but the patient population on an ongoing basis, it's not just when we need them, but as a community, just really instilling upon them a basic background. I think at the time that we're enrolling with them, we can engage them better, and then have more processes throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial, whereby they continue to become engaged and educated about what's going on.
Exactly. So, I think very much, Lucian, with regard to helping build this trust, but also the education and the awareness, what more do you think should be done or can be done to improve this?
Well, also listening to the discussion up until now, I also think that it really comes back to listening to the patients. And I'm not saying hearing, listening. As in, I think those three words that we see arising more and more, luckily, and we can change the order, as opposed to asking, what's the matter? What matters to you? I think that's one of the key issues, where also what Jane and Dana and also Sam mentioned, then you get that broader perspective. Then you get also more a trustworthy relationship that you even could broaden indeed beyond only the clinical trial, to make sure that you have the ability to ask patients or citizens or their family to contribute to, in the end of the day, those data for that clinical research. Not only during that phase that's exactly to figure out whether or not the efficacy and the safety is okay, but also afterwards. Just imagine that we could start using technology that we wear on a daily basis and that we could easily give feedback also after those whole trial systems have been closed to get a more early warning score about potential side effects that were not known during the trial itself, for instance, but also prior to that, in terms of when you start designing the protocols to make sure that the voice, also the ambition, but also what matters to patients is included in that. With that, get lower dropout rates. Because if you see the benefit also as a patient, not only from a clinical perspective, but just as mentioned, also from a quality perspective, you'll most likely be more prone to continue into it.
In terms of, Lucian, just to that point, because you brought up a really interesting, the amount of data that can be captured. What benefits do you see the role of big data in understanding the patient population and the experience that it can bring to clinical development? So what are some of the benefits do you think can be derived from big data?
To be honest, Lavishni, I think we're just scratching the surface. We're only just starting and tipping our toes into that. We now see that big data, apart from its definition, what is big data, can help. We're now looking into if you now talk about big data, it's about big numbers on a specific metric. But once we start to combine data that is being issued by patients themselves because they trust the relationship and said, you can have this data as well, we can also see patterns in that. And from that also understand maybe better how to really work in that. I think that, again, it's early work. We will see tons of progress. We will see setbacks. We will even see crooks, like we had crooks in the Middle Ages, and we will have crooks in the future that try to benefit and steal the trust from patients and also scientists and medical professionals. But that's also part of it. So I think we need good legislation. I think that's in position. I think we also need a stronghold communication about this, and also some real success, of course.
And I think bridging two things that you said, Leishan, in your last two comments is one, listening, and two, patients having their own data. Most of the data that I generate a really rich data set every single day of not only data about how much insulin was dosed and what my continuous glucose monitor says about my blood sugar, but I also have an algorithm that processes a number of variables. And I'm using it retrospectively, and at a population level, my community is using it, but the healthcare system is throwing this data in the trash and completely disregarding it because they didn't design this data flow. And they have no processes for taking in this data and using it. And this is just one example of many, and it's a complete waste. And so when we look at new drugs that have come out in the diabetes world, for example, there are a couple of new faster acting insulins, and the first two that have come out in the last year or two, there have been a number of problems when people switch from using it from injections to using it in an insulin pump site. Because of the buildup and the way the body reacts to what's in the insulin through the pump site, it's different than a single one-off injection. And so the companies have kind of looked at site issues and site failures within the study, but the studies weren't long enough to show the physiological kind of adaptation and adjustment to that. And so we are seeing a huge post-market flux of data in the patient community about how this is a challenge for a certain population of the community. And the companies are completely ignoring that. And the companies that are also coming along and doing other new modern insulins, when I brought it up to them and saying, what studies are you doing to address it? Because in insulin 1 and insulin 2, we've seen this problem, at 30% of the population or 50% of the population level. That's huge. And they're like, oh no, it's not a problem, but we're also not testing for it. And it's just mind-boggling that all of this data is thrown in the trash and then not used to better inform the trial development, the drug development process, the rollout. And the reality is that patients don't know that they can report this in. We don't know in the real world what is an adverse effect when you're living with a chronic disease, because it could be human error. It could be a one-off problem, or is this actually a routine thing? We don't know. That data gets tossed in the trash, and there's not that relationship or feedback mechanism or anybody actively listening to be pulling that back into the companies, to the regulatory bodies. And I just see all of that data falling through the cracks and us missing so many opportunities to learn.
I think those are great points. I love Lucian's tone of caution. There's great potential in big data. I love playing with data, but also to Dana's point, it depends on where the data is coming from and how it's being used. Garbage in, garbage out. And I'll add an additional perspective from what Dana was talking about is, there is actually some data about using big data from health systems that it can actually perpetuate some structural barriers and what other people call structural racism. Again, understanding that if you have to know where the data is coming from. If it's coming from a health system and not the patient, you're getting that perspective and you're limited only to that angle, if you will. And so therefore your analyses will reflect that and will be biased accordingly. And in and of itself, it's not wrong, but you have to add the component of the patient perspective in order to get, I think, the best and most accurate picture of that data.
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe to build on that, Lavashni, one of the things you're building on your question about big data, one of the slides that I often use for this is like this one at the right-hand side. We now use measurements that we take episodic-wise. For instance, when somebody comes to the clinic or when in the trial we run stuff, what we see now is that so technology is giving us the ability to take a higher frequency of those measurements. Of course, during with the use of wearables, for instance, and what we see in that is that the data aspect is changing from using historic data, like closed in scientific literature. We're now in the midst of using that recent data, like lab results of this morning, of an MRI, what have you, from yesterday, and we're now heading with a stronghold towards real-time data, and with it also the way that we can use data is changing from static to now at present giving also a bit of predictions that we have. In the near future, I expect that we will head on to prescriptalytics, where based on protocols, based on trials, based on big amounts of data, includes racial bias and all the other things that Sam rightfully mentioned, we're able to do so. And I think that's a very interesting part of that. And adding to that last one, we're going in terms of research from an N is 10,000 to 10,000 times that N is 1, which has often been mentioned, but really in terms of getting it operationalized, it's the technology that is creating that now as we speak, so to say.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that, Lucy. I mean, certainly, the use of data, but to one of the points that Dana mentioned, how are patients are being there's more and more burdensome protocols, and they are sitting in these hospitals, for 8 to 12 hours and having loads of samples being taken from them and not really understanding how it's being used. And I think that dialogue that needs to happen between the physician and the patient is actually quite critical, so that they are also aware of how their data is being used and why it's being used. So again, building up that understanding of why it's needed will also help with the whole trust, but also them sharing their data more openly with the physicians if they actually understand what's going on in the trial. We talk a lot about, getting the patient and including the patient into the protocol and the benefits you can derive. But certainly one of the things we also see is that it's, once you get the patient, actually keeping the patient engaged on the trial has shown that you have quite a high drop-off of once patients are involved in the trial. So what do you think could be done more or what can be done better by clinical study researchers to help alleviate the patient dropout rates? So I'll pass it to Sam.
Yeah, thank you. We need to spend so much more time on this side of the equation. We spend so much of our time and resources up front, recruitment, education, and then the actual screening and randomization of somebody. And then once they get through that and they're in the protocol, it's almost as if, okay, we're done with you. You're in the system now, and then let's go find someone else. And yes, recruitment is important, but again, to everybody's point, the return on investment has to incorporate the retention of it. And boy, the system and the companies and the CROs are heavily invested in retaining the investigators. I'll tell you that. We get newsletters left and right. We get monitors constantly hounding us. How many are you recruiting? What do you have in terms of screening numbers coming up? A lot of motivation, just what do you need? But in terms of the patient side, we've tried to figure out in our own research team how to better provide them some support, but there's not much we can do. Again, this should be part of the process. There should be systemic support for this, and there's no regular, at least in the trials that I've participated in, I've done over 50 since I've started. I've never seen a study focus significantly on patient retention after recruitment, in terms of regular education, regular feedback, providing people a sense of why they're giving the data after they've gone there, the results of the study afterwards. So we have a lot of room for improvement.
It's interesting because we were talking about the social dilemma at the beginning of this talk. And, as you just hear Sam talking there, you actually think, well, this is perfect for, a study actually having, privacy notwithstanding, some sort of engagement app, where if you think about a standard stakeholder management, these are your customers, these are your consumers, their most important thing, and they're the ones that are not being engaged with, communicated with, reassured, having any sort of forum for their fears and their concerns. Surely that's a classic place where somebody ought to be going with a, effectively a consumer type of engagement app.
I think that's a great idea. Also, in some other areas, there is data in cancer regarding patient navigators for chemotherapy. I always thought, especially in certain situations, again, I think it'd be too expensive on a routine basis for all trials, but the trials that I'm involved in involves highly vulnerable populations in terms of socioeconomically and racial populations, especially African Americans in the US that have a certain distrust of the medical system and especially the research field. And to have somebody of their own community and culture walk with them through the trial, there is data to help support that. And I haven't had any discussion or sensed any embrace of that type of approach.
I think one of the challenges with engagement in trials is oftentimes the recruitment is like help others. That's a tie that pulls people in to participate, but oftentimes the trials don't actually give you any direct benefit. Like they're taking so much from you and you're doing it altruistically to try to help your community and hope that maybe one day this is a treatment that helps you. But in the short run, it's a lot of take. It's a lot of pain, and suffering, and time. And so having a better understanding of like, what is the timeline of this helping realistically, and having the data, having the insights as much as you can given back to the patient, that's one small free thing that can be done, that better engagement that will likely keep people from dropping off, just because it's so easy to be like, I'm in pain, I'm suffering, I'm doing all of this on top of trying to live my life. Like, I really, really want to help, but it's just so non-motivating as a patient to do that. And once you've done kind of a bad trial experience as a patient, like your motivation is very, very low to do another one, or you may be more prone to drop out of the next one because you can see how bad it can be. I was lucky that I did a really good first trial that was so engaging for me as a patient that when I asked the researchers, could I see my data, they turned around the laptop screen and let me watch and let me like remote my boyfriend in so he could watch the data too remotely. Like it was a really cool experience where I was engaged as much as I wanted to be. But I've also done trials where that's not been the case. And it's kind of like night and day for, how motivating it was to do all the things in the trial and try to be a good patient in the trial. It's really hard to do that if you don't see either a benefit to yourself or a really clear timeline for how is this going to benefit your community? Is it worth the suffering that you as an individual are going to do, even if this is going to help you? And I don't think we do a good job of tying that together all the way through the trial for patients.
Yeah, you know what leaves me really empty at the end of a study visit is when we pay the reimbursement for the study. So people spend their time, they suffer, and they rightly should get reimbursed for some of the time and the transportation, but it makes it sound like a monetary transaction. There's no acknowledgement of the suffering that you mentioned. There's no acknowledgement in a tangible way that the patient is a partner in this. It's more of a transactionary type of process. And we need to get past that.
The word that comes to my mind listening to all of this has something to do with community management. Can you imagine that word? That you would say it's not a one-off. It's a process that starts at one given point and almost never ends. And sure enough, people will run into a condition and hopefully get treated in a proper way and then get besides that, unless it's a different kind of disease. But the community management aspect of it, indeed, as Sam rightfully says, often is more like a transactional aspect of it. And so that's also in terms of building trust, you need to engage on a different level, also during all the stages during the trial and during the research, which is often not done. It takes like 3 to 4 years sometimes before the study in the end of the day gets published. And then as a patient, it's only also the question if you've been notified about that. And then I've seen patients having to pay, because the study is after a paywall, to see the study that they contributed to themselves. And that was 2019, to be honest.
Yeah, that is incredible, especially as patients are becoming more digital and more digital aware. You know, we kind of coined the term now, they call the digital patient. And I think, you know, certainly the way companies are engaging with patients would have to change. And they are tending to take some steps towards that. But do you think, from what we've been discussing today, do you think to accelerate this increasing need to bring the patient into clinical development should be more legislated, and it should become actually just like how you need to have regulatory approval? Do you think we should actually be saying, well, actually including the patient voice into clinical development is now mandated by the authority bodies? Or do you think we should just leave it as an evolution and let's see how pharma companies deal with it?
So I'm torn on this one, because I think we see bodies like PCORI, which have as a funding body mandated patient involvement. But having looked at the protocols for studies and the outcomes of the studies, including the publication, oftentimes those mandates are then treated by a checkbox. So like, yeah, you have a patient's name on the paper, or you have a patient involved, but like, are they actually truly involved at every stage, equally a partner in it, changing the protocol, telling the researchers that they're doing it wrong, setting the study up right? It usually doesn't get that way unless you have just a super, super strong, experienced patient who's willing to go to bat and risk those relationships to make that change. So I think the challenge when we think about legislation is or mandates, how do we do that in a way that actually truly meets the goal and doesn't make it just a checkbox thing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would completely agree with that. And I think that whole tokenism debate is the big challenge here. And I think you could legislate, that would be one way. But then again, as we've said, the devil is in the detail, because by definition, you know, that doesn't guarantee the quality. And I think what we have to have here is that the governments and the funding agencies, there's an onus on them to also help safeguard and police this whole tokenism issue, and to really ensure that the patient involvement that is in there is equal, and that is equal partnership. And I think, you know, we've been talking about the patient and obviously thinking very much about the actual person that's in the trial. And I wonder here if, and the word segmentation is probably the wrong word to use, but I think by engaging with the advocacy agencies much more, where you might have patients that have actually, come out the other side, if you like, but are still very much that strong voice that are prepared to stand up for the future patients, they're not coping with the disease at that point in time. And therefore, by definition, you're likely to get a much better input because they're focused on really that quality input into the design, rather than trying to cope with the realities of a specific disease at that point in time. So I think we should be looking at different types of patient involvement through this journey.
When I think about the change that's required, I go back and that word cloud, there's aspects of that I think we're all on the same page here, that there's going to be a certain level of return on investment if we have a patient-centric approach. And be primarily a lot through adherence and retention and so forth. And that's very, that's an area of a lot of cost leak, I imagine. But I'm not smart enough to do the math on this, but I don't know if it's going to be enough to change the process that's in place right now. My sense anyway is that most of these clinical trials are very large. They're done by big companies. They incorporate these multinational CROs to run the studies. They have in place these processes that have been set for a long time, and it's not an easy cost to change them. So I would hope that there would be data to at least try to move the needle to change that process, which will be expensive up front, but downstream you would recover that. If they would buy that, I don't know. But sometimes you do need some legislation to move that needle. And so I imagine that it may eventually have to require both.
Yeah, and I think, Sam, to your point, there was a great study done in the cancer world a couple of years ago that came out and looked and compared the drug development process all the way from design to market release in cancer drug processes that involved patients and those that didn't. And those that involved patients from the early stages and all the way through, those drugs came to market earlier. The trial cost was less expensive, and the patient outcomes and the post-market data was more positive than those without. So there is starting to be some data that's really illustrating the benefits of changing the process. But healthcare is so siloed that that may be well known in the cancer world, but is it well known across all of healthcare? I don't know. And so that might be something we need to either translate or do more studies on. But at least there is some starting data, I think, to your point.
I see. So thank you very much. I just noticed the time. We have 5 minutes to go, so I think maybe we should start closing. I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and so thank you very much. I think some of the key points that we discussed that came out of it was really shifting the dialogue from what's the matter to actually what matters to the patient, and really understanding the patient at the end of the day is living with the disease. And getting as much information and insights from the patient very early on. So even at the point of potentially research, as opposed to waiting until the clinical development phase, or even during the, when they within the trial. Trust has come up as something that was quite powerful and quite strongly during our discussion today. And it's very important to build that trust between the patient and the physician, or the patient and the clinical researcher. So having that more open dialogue, treating the patient as the equal, involving them in the discussion, and ensuring that they have an awareness and an understanding of what's going to happen with them during the trial, but also the post-trial, and actually giving them the insights and awareness of how the data is being used, and sharing that data. I think it has been seen as something quite critical to the patient, so that they feel more involved as part of the journey, and they can also then contribute at any stage during the journey as well. We've been talking about also lots of data being thrown out. So again, looking at understanding from the clinical research and working with the patient and truly understanding what is the information that's needed and what's actually critical for the patient and for their outcomes. And I think lastly, it was all around transparency and having that transparent conversation, and making sure that the patient feels that they understand the journey that they are ahead. So we are on time. I want to say thank you very much to our panel. It's been fantastic having you here. It's been a great dialogue. I've enjoyed myself. I hope you have enjoyed yourself. And we'd like to thank you very much. I'm just getting actually Sarah pointing out to say that we would very much appreciate and welcome your feedback on the webcast. So please let us know your thoughts. A link will be shortly sent by Sarah, and there she is. She has sent out the link. So please do give us your feedback. And we will be continuing to have future conversations on the future of health and the digital transformation in our upcoming webcasts. So we will be sending out dates for those, and we do hope you will join us. So last words, I want to thank you again very much, and I wish you all a very good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are, and stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.